Yo guys, welcome to the Blue Podcast with me, Tom and Ben. How you doing, mate?
Good, thanks.
And today we are blessed to be with a guest called he's called Perch. He's from America. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, and great to talk to you today.
Yeah. So this is our second comic book guest we've had on the podcast. We've had 4 F1 ones for Ben. Now we got 2 F2 comic book and 1 rugby for me now.
Yeah.
So firstly, before we get into the podcast, why don't you tell us what you do for our viewers and listeners that may not know who you are, Perch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a number of things in comics. I mean, the biggest thing is I've been a retailer. So I've been somebody who actually owns and runs comic stores and has since the early 90s. So long guy, old guy doing comic book things. But then I've also, I have a lot of connections and friends in the industry. I've consulted from time to time to do little help for various creators or companies when they want to do some marketing or do some research, and and then have a hand in technology and other things. So that's me. I've been in this business forever.
Fair enough. I've noticed that when it comes to like these comic book YouTubers, that they've kind of been in the industry for a very long time. Is that have you found that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people get in and they don't leave. So it's a trap of an industry. I mean that in the best way. It takes hold of you, and there's so much to read and so much to do that it's easy to get stuck there.
Yeah. That's something that the previous guy said, that there's something, because there is so much to read, there's something for everyone.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think comics are great because you can, I mean, there's, at any given month, there's 200-300 comics being produced a week. And so you can find something for yourself if you need to.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't got it on me, but I have, I think the first 60-ish issues of the recent comic Flash Rebirth issues. I can't remember. When did it start? I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, I personally am a DC fan. The last guys we had on were Marvel fans, and they fortunately didn't ask me who I was a fan of, because otherwise we'd have different opinions. I wanted to, the simple early question everyone often is asked: DC or Marvel?
So historically, I've been more Marvel, but when you're in comics for a long length of time, I mean, I have great runs with DC that I absolutely love. There's characters there that are great. So I mean, at this point, the loyalty to the companies are kind of gone, and I really like certain creators, certain runs. There's characters on both companies and independent companies I absolutely love. How about yourself? What do you love?
I'm a DC fan. Have been from a young age. Ben, what would you say you are? Or are you just happy with anything?
One do I prefer?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really fussed.
I mean,
Wonderful.
I think the first character that kind of brought me into comics was obviously Batman, and the Flash he's my what's the word? My all-time favorite probably is the Flash. Don't know what it is. Just
you'll be happy that they're doing a live action film of him soon, aren't they? So
well, I just hope they don't ruin it with DC.
Yeah. It's a responsibility.
It is a big responsibility in my eyes, anyway. In my eyes. If you've been in
it's always a worry.
Was that?
I said no. It's always a worry. I think
Yes.
it's really common. You love these comics, and then they go and they mess them up in the movies, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that sort of I'm still there.
You still here?
Yeah, it's one of the things that Marvel have got right. I mean, not all of their films are groundbreaking, but they seem to be able to just manage to churn out just average films, which is something that DC just have not been able to do for some reason. And I think it comes down to the planning, because in Marvel that from the start they had a very clear plan.
Yes.
And they had the vision all the way through. With DC, they kind of just didn't do that. they just went in for it and had no idea, and that's why they are where they are at the moment.
No, you're
yeah.
absolutely right. Marvel and really, I think Disney behind them, they did have a plan for these movies, and they executed that plan. And there's definitely a style. I think if you didn't like the Marvel style of movies, then you're going to get a lot of movies in that same style. But for the masses, it was very successful for them, and of course, it's paid off. I mean, they've made several billion-dollar movies now, and DC is desperately hoping to kind of turn track and get back there.
I mean, it seems like they're starting to try and implement a plan in DC, but it's, I guess with various factors like COVID and other stuff, it's kind of been put on hold for a bit, because there's all that hoo-ha with releasing stuff on HBO Max as well as cinema, and basically cinemas dying and all that sort of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah,
it's for sure.
One of the main issues with DC in the films as well was they tried to rush it. Marvel did, what was it? Iron Man. They did the three main ones straight away before they even thought about Avengers. Yeah,
I mean, all in all, there's, I think, is it 23 films, including the Endgame and Far From Home. So
yes,
and with DC, they did what? Batman v Superman, Wonder Woman, and then they did Justice League, didn't they? So
didn't they do Wonder Woman after
Suicide Squad?
After Batman vs Superman, didn't they?
They did, They went back there. It was, I mean, they just you're absolutely right. They wanted to rush to get to their team film. They went too quickly. They're trying to catch up, and unfortunately, the audience wasn't ready. And then, of course, COVID, and
yeah. There's and it's, I mean, not so much I don't know about America, but in the UK, there's arguments with like the cinema chains and the what do they call them? Basically the companies being like, well, we need these films to stay relevant, and then they're just like, no, we're just going to put it on HBO Max and it'll be sorted. So there's arguments galore at the moment, isn't there?
It will make things easier for sure. I think, and all these things are very intertwined. Comics and movies and these properties, and especially going forward, and especially for DC now, all of the comics are going to be very closely aligned to what they're going to try and do on HBO Max and their streaming service, and the movies. So these fates are all very carefully intertwined. I mean, if you're a DC fan, just this morning, an hour ago, I guess the embargo went up that, we're getting a brand new Joker ongoing comic that is going to be out in the market, and they're going to want to at least make some connections to the movie, even though it doesn't sound like the movie at all. So it is very much, if you're a movie fan and you love comics, you're looking forward to at least 2 to 3 years of a lot of new comics, a lot of new movies, very closely connected for DC and Marvel. And it's but the same argument is happening over here in the US. The theater chains are very angry. The distribution houses are very upset. That's going to be tough. I mean, those, in theory, that is the lifeblood. But on the other hand, if you're a studio, you can't just write off another year. You can't afford to write off another year, and we don't know when these things are opening up. So
I mean, like you say, Marvel are doing something very similar on Disney Plus, and I remember I saw a quote of the Disney CEO being like, "Yeah, we think we did a bit too much too soon with Star Wars." And then they announced like 10 shows for Disney Plus for Star Wars. It was like, huh? I thought you just said you did too much too soon. Like, but obviously.
Also something with the what was that?
I was saying, obviously, it's Disney Plus is working for them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be announcing so many shows.
Yeah,
for sure.
And it's I think also with the COVID happening, there will be so much stuff would have been planned to have come out during COVID, and so much stuff would have also been planned for the time after COVID. And now all that stuff's kind of going to happen at the same time. So it's just going to be a massive
stuff that was
flux.
supposed to happen has been pushed back, so now it's at the same time as the other stuff. Yeah, I get
Exactly.
you.
Yeah. And on the DC starting to link some of their comics closer to the movies that will be coming out, something that Marvel have done in the past is they will release comic books to test the waters for storylines in the movies, like a bit before, I've noticed. And DC obviously never have done that. I don't know if you noticed that as well, Perch.
Yeah, absolutely. It is part of the strategy. It makes sense. You know, comic books are a lot cheaper to make. You can test out, you know, plots and characters and ideas very, very inexpensively. You can get some, you know, some market research. The only challenge that they have, I think, is that the comic book audience, the people who are buying comics, is increasingly a smaller amount of people, and it maybe doesn't give them as much information as they want. And they're still working on getting the comic books really synced up. Like, you know, for example, this Joker comic that was announced just this morning. It is, you know, we have this Joker movie, which was kind of a study of mental illness. It was really a more dramatic, more serious take on the Joker. Whereas the comic is going to be the Joker is committing crimes around the globe and Commissioner Gordon is chasing him. So it's a very different kind of feel. So I think they're still working on that plan. You know, DC has kind of made the statement that if they're, you know, for their new comics that they're going out with in March, because they're going to kind of redo their universe in March. All those comics, again, yes, exactly. Well, it's, you know, it's every 2 years we got to do that. It is. I think that all of their comics have to have at least some connection to some movie somewhere. And so far, everything that's been announced has a show or a cartoon or a movie or something connected to it. So it is, maybe they get that better together. But yeah, it makes sense to test the comics out before you do the movies, and you might as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because DC certainly do not want what's happened in their past few movies to happen again, do they? Because I don't think they haven't really got the time for another flop, do they? In terms of
I think it all seems in terms of I don't know much about comics, but in terms of the film and series, and maybe the case with the comics as well, that it seems quite fragmented because they have obviously the DCEU that they're trying to sort out, and they've got that Batman trilogy with Robert Pattinson that was supposed to be part of that, and now it's not. And then they've got the Joker movie that's not part of that. So it's all like they've got these ideas and they want to do them.
Right.
And they were like, oh, we're going to do this cinematic universe, and because it's not worked out, now they're like, oh, we've still got these ideas, still want to do them, but we can't do it there, so we're just going to do it anyway, but a different universe, and like just sort of pushing sorting out the DCU back and back and back until they can't leave it anymore, sort of thing.
Yeah. It's a problem, I think, and that's to your point earlier. Tom, Ben, the Marvel universe did just such a better job of giving you an orchestrated. If you walked in, you knew what you're expecting, and you knew what more or less this order that the films go in. There was a structure to it, and with DC, you have a Birds of Prey movie, you have a Joker movie, you have a Wonder Woman movie. They're radically different. There's no commonality, and I think that's something that holds them back a little bit. It is something that they want to try and solve, but at the same time, I think they're trying to find their identity, and in many ways that is true, I think, of DC. In general, as a company made the joke earlier, they have completely redone their universe multiple times in the last few decades. I mean, it feels like that is a company kind of in some ways always trying to find itself. Really great characters, but sometimes they're always trying to figure themselves out.
I guess they if there is a positive in those films being radically different to each other, is that they give the directors in Marvel a bit of freedom, but they have the template they have to stick to. But in DC, they give the directors the freedom to do it. I mean, obviously, with Justice League and Batman v Superman, they didn't quite go to plan, but it seems with sort of the more recent ones that they've been giving the directors the freedom to do what they want. So you're getting these quite interesting sort of takes on the characters.
Yeah, it's like Aquaman, Wonder Woman, and Birds of Prey, I think, are the three most recent ones that haven't really been following a theme, but they are doing really well individually.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
But it's the way it's the problem is because they wanted to make a franchise doing that, like you're saying, there isn't a commonality between them, so people not expecting what they're going to watch when they're going in, so therefore they're not going to be as inclined to go and watch it, which is a strange thing, but it's one of the I guess it's the truth.
It is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, and comics. I mean, comics and movies are all trying to find their spot. I mean, it is you know, the other factor here in kind of all this is that, you know, comics are increasingly expensive. So you have a comic book coming in at, you know, $4.99. A lot of the new DC books are being announced at that $5 range. They're going to have more at the $7.99 range. At that point, you know, you look at Disney Plus. Disney Plus is $6.99. You get an entire month of a streaming service for the same cost, or, you know, just slightly higher than a comic book. That's a tough thing to compete with, and that's another factor in here as you're trying to figure out kind of your audience and how to grow comics and get more people into it. You know, if you're buying like 4 comics, you're over $20 a month. Meanwhile, you've got, you know, an HBO, you can give HBO Max and Disney Plus both and have access to their entire kind of entertainment library for that price. I mean, that's going to be a factor too. So it's going to drive more people into the movies for sure. It's going to encourage that kind of viewership, and comics are going to have to adapt. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's kind of why I stopped getting the Flash issues, because it's kind of, as a student, I don't really have the money every week to pay for comic every week.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's me with us saying about like DC having a lack of planning with the films. It seems like they've got. I don't really watch DC shows, but it seems like they've got a lot more. They do a lot more planning for the TV series that they do, because they have all the crossover events and stuff, and it seems to work quite well.
Like the Arrowverse.
Yeah. So if they can implement that somehow, they might be onto something.
Yeah. It's a crazy space, I think, for people who you know, the readers, customers, fans, or shop owners, or people who've been in a space. It's definitely been quite a journey, I think, over the years. It's tough if you are a comic fan, or I think probably worse if you run a comic shop and you're seeing these movies making $1 billion or more, and then you know, you're in there struggling with your comics. It's a weird thing to think, you know, why aren't the comics benefiting more from, you know, these kind of epic movies? And I mean, you know, there's a lot of factors, of course, the price, and in many cases they're not the same and everything else. But even DC's struggles, you know, even Justice League, which had a lot of problems in the movie theater, you know, there's a lot of comic retailers who are just begging for that kind of attention on the comic. Like, they take the bad attention, any attention, in a lot of cases. And it's really shown how comics have changed as entertainment.
Yeah. I think the most recent, in terms of DC, thing that I think was most talked about, I don't know if you'd agree as well, is the 3 Jokers storyline. I think that had a lot of people, even not in comics, questioning and actually pushing it. Does that not happen very often then? It's from coming from like someone who's been in retail and stuff like that?
Not as much as it used to. I think that there hasn't been these kind of breakout comics, and I think part of the problem is and this is where I think Marvel's more to blame than DC. You know, Marvel got very hooked on promoting, you know, this is the most important comic, you got to read it, everything's changing after this comic, you pay attention, and they would do that every few months, and so their audience just kind of learned to tune it out. And so, you know, you go further back, you go to stuff like Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and those were both DC books, but even, you know, stuff like Secret Wars, and you got stuff from Marvel that would get crossover attention. And nowadays, you know, there's just so much hype that a lot of people ignore it. So every now and then, though, you get a comic like 3 Jokers comes out. It has good crossover appeal. It's written so that, you know, you don't really have to be following comics month to month. You can pick it up and it's great. You know, the quality of the story is good. and it breaks out. And if you look at the sales, it's doing very, very well in trade paperback for stores. I think it is DC's highest right now. It's new, but it's going to do very well for several years. And I think that in this case, DC's got their act together, better than Marvel, in the sense that they do have this Black Label part of their publishing line. They've got this way to kind of produce these books that are not tied to other things. They can separate out and just kind of promote. And I think they do have a little bit more in the comic book world, a little bit more credibility, where Marvel's trying to grab back that credibility, but it's just it's going to be harder for them. They've burned a lot of retailers and a lot of they burned a lot of people with fake hype in the past. And but I thought, I don't know, I take it you read Three Jokers. Did you like that book?
It was good, but I feel like it was slightly overhyped. I don't know. I don't know if that's. I think is that your opinion as well?
Well, it was. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I thought it was good.
It was good.
Yeah,
Definitely
it was. Yeah, it was delayed for I think 4 years. Yeah, so I think there was a little bit of a. I believed it was going to be bigger than it was, because I mean, after, you're 4 years in, finally this thing's coming out. Yeah. I think if it had come out when it was scheduled, I wouldn't have felt the same way. But because of that wait, it felt a bit overhyped. Yeah.
Yeah, because for Ben and other listeners that don't know, it was revealed in Rebirth, the start of Rebirth, wasn't it? The fact that there was 3 Jokers, not just one. And then obviously it took them 4 years to actually get to releasing the issue. Okay. So kind of there was all this when it first happened. I remember there being huge amounts of hype about it, like, oh my gosh, how are they going to do this? And maybe they should have done it after 2 years. If they still wanted to wait a while, 2 years is probably better than 4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess that's the key with all things is if you like. With a lot of things now, I mean, we talk about football, soccer for you. A lot of things now, it seems to get overhyped to the point of where the actual match comes, or in this case, the comic comes, and you're like, nah. So it's like, but I think it's a byproduct of social media almost.
For sure.
It's that sort of constant noise about something gets you so hyped up for it, and then when it actually comes, you're like, no, not really what it was. But there's not a lot we can do about it, really.
Not really, no.
Absolutely overhyped, and I'm weird. I'm one of the weird people in America, I think, who does call it football, calls your football. It never stuck with me. I don't know why. I'm not. I spent some time over in Europe, so maybe it stuck at that point.
Yeah.
But yes, it is football to me as well. I always kind of chuckle here in the U.S. when it's like, we've got football. It's like, oh, this is a sport where there's action for about 10 seconds, and then we take a 2-minute break, and then some more action. That sounds great. Anyway, I just lost all my U.S. fans right there with that comment.
Oh no.
It is no. I think you got to be careful with hype, and comic books has such a delicate audience that, and in many cases, it's weird because their audience is kind of already predisposed to see amazing things. They're used to these characters who can turn back time and shoot laser beams out of their eyes, and I mean, they could do anything. And so, because of that, you don't really need to hype it. You just got to have to promise a really good story. You got to promise that you're going to have a good time reading this. You don't have to do this, the world will never be the same after this comic. You will never see things in the same way again. And it's like, just lay back a little bit. People will be okay.
Yeah, I think they did that quite well with DC Metal. Was it? Was it early last year? Was it?
2 years ago.
2 years ago.
2018, 2017. Yeah, it was. I think it was true. Yeah, Metal. The first Metal series was. I mean, it was an event that DC hadn't had an event like that in a little bit of time, and it kind of, they undersold it, and I mean that in a good way. They didn't go all overboard with the hype when it first came out. It did build, and I think it caught some people by surprise, again in a good way, that they were doing this. And it was, I think I heard from a lot of people at the time in the shop and outside that, they appreciated that DC was just kind of putting out a story and focusing on that and not focusing on massive hype. And yeah, I think they've in the newest death metal, kind of the sequel, it's kind of been the opposite. They definitely hyped the hell out of that one. But bit of a shame.
It is, yeah. No, yeah, that's I'm actually surprised how much I seem to know about comics. I didn't realize.
You didn't say you were interested in them.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I know, but I don't know. I just seem to. I feel like I know more than I thought I did. Anyway.
You do. Yes, you're an expert. It works.
Oh, no. Yeah, I do have. I'm going here. I do have my 2 big boxes of comics. I think my first. What was your first? Do you remember, Perch? What was your first comic book that you bought or read?
Yeah, well, I'm old, so for me, I remember catching some in the 70s, Legion of Superheroes at DC, and kind of at the same time got into reading some Fantastic Four issues. The first comic that really caught me that I absolutely loved was X-Men. At the time, Chris Claremont and John Byrne was doing this pretty epic run of X-Men, and I came into that. It was a Dark Phoenix saga, which they've adapted pretty terribly to the movies. Now, those are the Marvel movies we don't talk about because they're not done nearly as well. But it is, those comics back in that time, there was, the writers were unafraid of just having these storylines go on for years. And so you could get into them and like 2 years later, you're getting the payoff. And, as a kid, that was a good thing. I mean, there was not, this is definitely old man talk, but it's like you didn't have, streaming services, you didn't have a console, you didn't have all this kind of stuff. And it was good entertainment. And so if you had a writer and a comic that could kind of, keep things going week after week. And the great part about coming into comics at that point, especially for something like Legion of Superheroes or Teen Titans or X-Men or Avengers, is you start reading and you're on issue 200. So you don't have to wait for the next month. You can start going backward to fill out this stuff, and you spend years doing that. So that was a great time in comics, and in many ways, it's kind of sad because now more recently, comic book companies like to relaunch the comic with a new #1 issue, and it kind of breaks that model a little bit.
I mean, I think for the Flash, there's been just in the last decade, new Flashpoint, New 52, Rebirth, been part of Metal, and is there a new one right now?
Yeah, there is. Well, we have a series that's still going at the moment, and then it will be, I don't think it's going to get relaunched in March. We'll have a new creative team on it, but it is, there will be more Flash for sure.
Yeah, so that's for Ben, that shows how much kind of it can change within over quite a short period of time in terms of life, really. Is quite mad. I think have you heard of Comic Historian on YouTube?
Yes, absolutely. He's one of the bigger guys who breaks things down, along with Comics Explained and some of the others.
Yeah. I think Comic Historian was the channel that kind of helped push my nerdiness for comics, because I couldn't always go out and buy these comics, whereas he would do them in a talk along fashion, and that meant that I could actually keep up to date with what was happening.
Right.
Whereas I think in England there's a lot less of there's not really a comic book store down the road.
Well, I mean, where I am, it's like I said in the last last comics podcast, that I've been into a comic book store once with one of my friends from school, and it was in the Northern Quarter in Manchester, which is like the more high-end place. So it shows that the accessibility of comics. I mean, now you've got mail order and stuff, but if you actually want to go to a store, accessibility is not very good. Really.
I think the main one I've ever been to, I've only been to, I think, comic book store 3 times. Is one in big one in London.
Right.
But I'd have to travel into London to go to a comic book store rather than kind of where I live. So is it more, would you say comics are more accessible than America?
In the UK, or sorry, yeah, definitely comic books are more accessible. Well, now I'm saying it too quickly. There are some comic shops certainly in the UK, I think, that are out there. I think they're probably a little bit more accessible in the US, but it really based on where you live. If you live in one of the kind of metro areas in the US, there's usually quite a few options now. We'll see how many of those options are still in business after COVID kind of passes us by. But it is, I think you have a few other options. There's a couple ready-made kind of mail order systems. There's a few people that you can get stuff online. You can, Barnes and Noble and big bookstores still carry stuff like that. So I think there's probably a little bit more accessibility, but it's probably not as far away as it used to be. I think it was harder. It used to be easier in the US, and I think it's gotten a little bit harder. So we're probably a lot closer in regions than we used to.
Yeah.
I just thought that was a good, interesting thing to ask. We last time we were on the podcast, we asked the guests when it comes to comics some questions. I think it might be interesting to see your take on these questions. You think should we do that, Ben?
Yeah.
Right. What are the best single issue stories that you've read in comics, in your opinion?
Single issue stories. So immediately my mind goes to some storylines. I think that Claremont had a number of them in X-Men. He was good at some standalone comic stories. I think Grant Morrison had some really good ones when he was doing Batman. He had some really nice stories there. I think Jonathan Hickman, he did some work in Fantastic Four. He's doing some things in X-Men right now. Some of those standalone comics have been pretty great. I mean, it is, J.M. DeMatteis, I think, had some with Spider-Man. Now this cheats a little bit to your question, but there's this storyline, Kraven's Last Hunt, which was a 6-issue story. That's obviously not a standalone comic, but it was, by today's standards, pretty short.
Yeah, definitely.
That kind of stuff is, those were absolutely brilliant. And I think Frank Miller did some stuff on Daredevil that was pretty classic. I don't know. There's a lot. Over the years, there's been a lot of great standalone issues.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, as I said before, I'm not into comics at all, really. Tom's interested in comics, but if I was to start reading comics, where would you say is a good place to start? So, like, I quite like sort of. I like either Marvel or DC, really.
Yeah,
Star Wars fan as well.
Even others. What was that? Sorry.
You're a big Star Wars and Star Trek fan, aren't you?
Star Wars, yeah, and Star Trek a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think that there are some good jumping on points for you. I think there's a lot that's been collected or, in a trade paperback, an omnibus collection. You can do that kind of stuff. I think the key is to figure out kind of what you like. Do you like sci-fi movies? Do you like action adventure? Do you like more gritty films? There's a comic that kind of aligns with your interests. So what's your give me like your some of your favorite movies? What do you like?
I quite like sci-fi, so like as in comic book movies or
anything you like.
I quite like Interstellar,
Okay.
Ad Astra. Trying to think of what ones. Put me on the spot.
Put me on the spot for the first time.
Gravity is good. First Man, that's a good film. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. So in terms of kind of some sci-fi comics, there's probably some runs of Guardians of the Galaxy that probably fit that. Dan Abnett, Andy Lanning did a run of Guardians of the Galaxy that would be good to jump in on. That probably fits that. Current Guardians of the Galaxy is a little bit more like the movie, so a little bit more comedy is in the comic. But for some dense sci-fi action you have there, there's a brand new series by Al Ewing called We Always Find Them When They're Dead. That's very sci-fi, very much feels like a Christopher Nolan kind of sci-fi film. There's if you're kind of more into sci-fi, but with kind of a Star Wars feel to it, there's this book Saga that is out that is pretty popular right now. Not Marvel or DC, but definitely has that feel to it. Over kind of for DC, I mean, it's tough because, you know, in many ways, some of the runs of Legion of Superheroes would be possibly what you'd be into, but the current run is very much like it's like a reality TV show, and a lot less sci-fi than some of us are used to, which is kind of a bit of a shame. From what I'm told, there's a book called Far Sector that might work. That is a thing that he produces out there, and I mean, yeah, there's lots. I mean, obviously there is a Star Wars book that they actually produce. Unfortunately, it's like if you love the movies, it's going to give you the movies, and so really connected to that. But yeah, I think there's, you know, there's a lot of, for better or worse, there's a lot of number one issues, a lot of starting points out there right now to jump in on, a lot more than there used to be.
Cool.
Yeah. Right. Well, I was kind of Guardians of the Galaxy was actually something that the last guest
said. The Guardians of the Galaxy said that it was the other people we had on.
That would be good for you as well.
So that must be the one.
There you go.
There you go. What are the best dark, gritty, or kind of off-kilter superhero-based graphic novels that are out right now, do you think?
That are out right now. I mean, there
or
are,
in general, or whichever's easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have quite a lot in that space. I mean, Frank Miller has done things with Sin City and with Hardboiled and with I mean, he's just got a lot of comics out there that kind of fit that niche. Now it's been a while, but definitely he's got some of that. If you're kind of moving your way up, you know, Alan Moore did things with Watchmen and with V for Vendetta, and some of those books that were definitely more dark and more gritty of a take on superheroes. You know, there was for a while, Marvel had a line called the Max line, and they had Punisher Max, and they had a couple titles there. It was intended to be a more adult view of these comics, definitely a little more dark, more blood, more violence, all of that stuff, all the stuff the Americans love, all kind of packed into a comic. But it you know, that's one. I think that, you know, DC created this thing called Black Label with the intention of telling more of these gritty stories. It hasn't necessarily worked out that way. A lot of the comics that they've published are not, you know, dark and gritty like they initially planned. You had a comic called Batman Damned that was a more dark look on Batman that came out. But then they've also put Scott Snyder's, you know, the Last Night on Earth and other things into Black Label. So it's really just become a place where, you know, comics that weren't directly affecting the continuity could go. If you're going to go into the indies, I mean, there's tons of comics that fit that bill. Everything from kind of classic comics like Spawn up to kind of more recent things. I'm looking over my shelf to kind of just see what I was coming out. I mean, The Walking Dead was probably a great example of a very long comic that fit that kind of dark and gritty zombie world. You know, your favorite characters could die at any minute kind of thing. And you know, there's quite a lot out there. You know, I think that's an area. It's weird in comics. So it's those types of comics get very popular, and they kind of sit there for a couple of years, and then everybody kind of says, "Oh, hang on, we need to bring back hope and optimism. Let's get away from the dark and gritty stuff." And then they stop publishing for them for a while, and then about every 5 years they kind of come back, and we see a resurgence of it.
Cool.
Fair enough.
So you mentioned a lot of like series of comics. What would you say is, like, in your opinion, the best series of comics for you?
You know, I think that, you know, over time, in the long run, it has been X-Men for me. That's why when you initially asked me, I'm more of a Marvel fan, probably because I really got hooked with that for 20 years or so. Really loved that comic. It's not my favorite comic today, but that's the one that kind of sticks in my head. Right. Beyond that, I mean, I go back to Legion of Superheroes. It's a comic that that's an old comic that's been around forever, and lots of great memories of that in terms of a series. But you know, there are new things being built all the time. About earlier this year, this company AWA started they're just a brand new comic line and a comic series, and I've been impressed with the quality that's come out of there. They're not the big two, but they have a lot of artists and creators outside of Marvel and DC that are putting content in there. You know, the other comic I'm really enjoying right now is a book called Batman White Knight, and it's by Sean Gordon Murphy, and it's an incredibly good book. And so that one, he does it in series. Like he'll do 8 issues and then there's a pause and they'll do another 8 issues. And that's a really nice series. And
it has felt like it's been going on for a while, hasn't it? Because obviously the pauses.
Yeah, we've had 2 full runs, and then we're on the 3rd, which is Harley Quinn, White Knight Harley Quinn, and it's a take on Batman, but it's an alternate universe. You don't have to worry about any of the other stuff going on, and it's a really it's got a dark and gritty kind of art style, but it's not an over the top gritty story. It's a really smart series.
Cool. I'm going to ask you this question, but I want you to not instantly say Death of Superman. What are the best comic book kind of story arcs that involve deaths or rebirths?
I mean, there's been several, of course. Death of Superman is one, but the death of Jean Grey in the X-Men is another. I think that the death of Batman was one that it was probably set up very, very nicely. I think Grant Morrison was kind of concluding his run with a really kind of epic end to Batman, and he accomplished that. The rebirth part was not as good. They bringing him back bit.
Was that the bit before James Gordon did the whole bat suit thing?
Yes, that was much before. So that actually came. That was almost the second time he died.
Oh.
Characters die a lot. It was a good series, but the returns, the deaths are often much better than the returns. I think that comic companies don't really know how to bring them back elegantly. I was trying to just think of one that was done well. Captain America obviously died, and that was a big deal. And that rebirth was very strange, and how that one came about. Anytime the comic writers like throwing in things like a time displacement bullet, that's always a bad sign. Like that story is not going to go well. But there's been a couple. I think we're still waiting on a few. I think the return of the rebirth of Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier, was handled really, really well. That's a case where the rebirth was better than the death in a lot of cases. So that's probably it. Death of Superman's funny because it was very much a marketing event. It was a death, but it was tied into what they were doing at the TV show at the time. You had this show Lois and Clark out, and the original plan for DC was that they wanted the Superman and Lois to get married in the comic, but Lois and Clark was going to do the wedding. So the TV show told the comic you can't do a wedding, and so they kind of scrambled, at the last minute to figure out something else to do, and they landed on let's kill Superman. And so the whole thing
very drastic change.
yeah, absolutely. No, it was an accident in a lot of cases, and the intention was they were going to kill him and then bring him back like 2 months later. And it turned out that his death sold so many copies that they just kept it going for a little while longer so they could kind of milk more money out of the return. But yeah, the death of Superman was not actually supposed to happen. It was they really wanted to have the characters get married, and the TV show kept them from doing it.
That's quite crazy, actually, considering how big that storyline is. It's and that's the creation of Doomsday as well. So the creation of Doomsday is technically an accident. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's why. If you go back and you look at that comic, so much of it was last second thinking. Like Doomsday was this kind of random, alien creature that we'd never heard of before that just kind of showed up, and the character design for most of it was just him kind of wrapped in rags because they hadn't figured out the look yet. So they just this comic was being planned like weeks before it was supposed to go to printer, and they were just kind of making it up as they went. And it is amazing to think about because the comics sold so well, got so much attention, but and ultimately got a lot more attention than the TV show did for this wedding. So it's just funny how these things work out.
I didn't know about that. So that's quite interesting.
A lot of things are accidents, aren't they?
Yes, a lot of things in comics were accidents. That is very, very true.
It's like the Hulk being green was just because they couldn't print him in gray anymore or something.
Yeah, it was kind of a coloring error, and that was not a planned event either. I mean, a lot of this stuff was, you go back, you look at, this comic Secret Wars, which I suspect the Marvel movies will get around to doing. This is something a lot of fans remember as being a pretty major moment in Marvel history. And the reason that comic series happened, Secret Wars, is because Marvel had a deal to do toys. And so they were wanting to make action figures, and they needed to write a comic around those action figures to introduce and help sell them. So that entire comic came about because they had this toy licensing deal that they were working on, and they had the characters with these shields and everything else. And that comic was completely made based off of them wanting to sell some toys. It had nothing to do with
massive storyline as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's a crazy, comics are a lot of accidents over the years. You know how creators get onto titles. I mean, a name that comes up a lot is this guy Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief, kind of head of Marvel for a period of time during that Secret Wars event and during a lot of their success in the 80s. But he actually got his start in comics when he was 13, and he did that because he was reading at this time DC books and Marvel books, and he felt that Marvel books were more mature, better storylines, basically, in the Marvel books. And so he wanted to get a job in comics. He knew he'd have a hard time doing it in Marvel. So he started writing DC, saying, here's what I would do with a comic. And he was writing scripts. Basically, he was writing Legion of Superheroes at 13. And he was kind of drawing them out himself. And the people over at DC were like, hey, this guy has some good ideas. Let's hire him. So he gets hired by DC at 14 to start writing Legion of Superheroes. DC did not completely realize how young he was. They knew he was young, but they didn't know he was that young.
Yeah.
And he was on that book for several years. I mean, like more than 5 years. That's how he spent his teenage years, was writing DC Comics at 14, which is just crazy if you think about it.
That is crazy to think about.
Gee. Yeah. I kind of like it's kind of mind-boggling. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically at the start of secondary school here, and he's got a job at DC.
and at the time, that comic this is in the 70s, Legion of Superheroes was one of their top-selling comics. So he was not only was he writing it, he was writing one of their best-selling books, and he would go on from there to get the top job at Marvel, and it's in his basically in his 20s. It's really pretty crazy.
Yeah, Ben, the Legion of Superheroes was a massive comic book at that time.
Yeah.
So
Cool. Anyway, last question. In this series of questions, anyway, is what are the most ridiculous superheroes or supervillains that you've ever seen in comics?
I mean, there's a lot. I mean, you had a character in Marvel that got introduced by a writer called Brian Michael Bendis, whose power was to shoot gold balls out of himself, and his name was Gold Balls. I mean, there's tons. I mean, it feels like comic book writers, they'll get a crazy idea, maybe after a good night at the pub, and then these things make their way into comics pretty easily. I don't know. I think in some cases, some of these characters are ridiculous, and they wind up, getting redeemed and having a good arc. I mean, if you go back and you look at some of the early Batman books, where you had Batman and Robin, and I mean, that whole premise is insane. If you think about it, you have this kid who's running around in kind of acrobat tights, and it just with this bat creature. I mean, all this stuff is kind of silly if you really break it down that way. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the Flash has had some crazy villains in his rogues gallery that are just very wacky powers, and Batman had a villain called Kite Man. There was one that was Condiment Man, who would shoot like ketchup and mustard out of things. I mean, this is
Polka Dot Man as well.
What's that?
Polka Dot Man as well. He's in the new Suicide Squad.
That's right, Polka Dot Man as well. I mean, there's no shortage of kind of crazy concepts and characters. There's a character that Marvel had in the 80s, and whose power, I think her name was Cloud, and her power was that she had clouds that kind of hid the naughty bits, and that was what she was. She would just fly around.
there was a villain, I think, who was made up of the drug coke in the 80s or 90s.
Oh, that's right. Well, the powers came from
Yeah.
Coke. Yeah.
Yeah, which was crazy. Why would you have that in a comic book?
Yeah. When comics, I think there was this aspect where comics had this comics code for a long time, where they were, they had to make sure their comics in some way were geared toward kids. The rules were very weird. Like you couldn't have villains be sympathetic. You couldn't. There's just a lot of very strange kind of rules they had to work around. And so every now and then, when the comic could get around those rules, when they would be able to break them, they would just, it was like there was repression. The writers would just throw out ludicrous stuff like, let's go ahead and have this villain that basically is powered by cocaine. I mean, that's they would immediately go to absolutely crazy parts for no apparent reason. It was always very funny to watch that happen.
Yeah. For Ben, there's and other viewers, back when comics were kind of blowing up, there was basically like a whole comics regulation rules that they had to follow for a while, and they kept on getting more stricter and stricter. Am I right there, Perch?
Yes, absolutely. And the rules were very. I mean, so you have to go further back in the 50s. There was this Frederick Wortham guy who really was concerned that comics were corrupting the youth. It's not unlike what we've seen with comments about video games more recently, that the kids are going to read these comics and they're going to turn into horrible monsters. And part of it was, back in that time, there were a lot of comics that were kind of horror based and they were shock based. So there were just lots of just crazy violence on the page. But it was all kind of silly violence. It was, silly is maybe the wrong word, but it was, I don't know, you wouldn't take it seriously today if you looked at it. I'll put it that way. And so these, there were a lot of, in America anyway, a lot of, repression going on. Classic America was going on. And so they put in this Comics Code Authority, and it had, again, very strange rules. In some cases, all very kind of racist rules. I mean, in many ways, I mean, a lot of the rules you look at today, you're like, yikes, there's no way anyone would want to live by these things. And then as years went on, the rules would kind of randomly change. They would, some would go away, new ones would come on. And it in many cases, comics got tougher. And every time there was a big success, like a Watchmen type comic where Alan Moore had, Dr. Manhattan, just this bald blue guy walking around naked with everything on display. Then new regulations would come up, and it was always like kind of fighting this parent group versus creativity for a long period of time, and it created a lot of very disjointed comics.
When did it end?
It really ended in the 90s. I think the last gasp of it was in the early 2000s. It officially came to a close, but by that point, the major publishers had already moved away, and in the 90s, both Marvel and DC came to the conclusion that killing their characters and having kind of extreme violence and other things was super popular with kids, and so they quickly got rid of that and went for sales.
Is there, when you're speaking to someone kind of new to comics, is there what's the word? Is there anything that you think would shock them about kind of a fun fact about comics?
Well, I think the amount of work that goes into it, I think, is probably surprising for people, especially as we live in this digital age now where a lot gets done faster. Many comic books, when you're reading it, in 22-page comic book was probably initiated 6 months earlier. And so if you think about all the people involved, you had somebody writing it and putting together a script and a plot outline, getting that approved, sending out to an artist. Many artists still work with physical media, with pen and paper, drawing. So a lot of them have moved digital, but still there's this kind of very labor intensive process to this comic book that gets written and drawn and colored and inked and lettered and everything, and then printed, and out it goes. And so you have this kind of $3.99 or $4.99 comic in your hands, and it's the product of a lot of work. And then when you look at it, there are close to 200 comics that are published and sent out a week, and that's just a massive amount. of books. I mean, Marvel alone will do something like 80 to 90 comics a month. And it's an absurd amount. I don't think people really realize the scope of this business, and how many comics there are, and the problem of it's comics are not making enough money. I mean, that's the unfortunate dirty secret in all this, is that even with all that work, all those comics, all those things coming out, most comics sell well under 100,000 copies, which is really not that many. You have YA and kids books. You have stuff like I don't know if it's in the UK, but there's a book called Dog Man that's aimed at kids, and that book is selling millions of copies. And so the scope is all wrong. So you would have the impression, if you saw that the Avengers is making $2 billion, that the comics have to be doing better than this, and the reality is comics are not. There's this huge gap between the movies and the comics, and I think that always surprises people when they realize that.
Yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, Ben, did you know
that? No, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't think that comics would be making more than the films, but I would have thought they'd be making more than they are, based on that, which is surprising. Definitely.
Yeah, we're in a strange place with comics right now, where I think people believe that paper comics, paper products are becoming a dinosaur, and at some point everything will be digital, and we'll be reading on tablets and everything else. And so there's this kind of weird point in the comic industry where I think a lot of people are concerned about how much future it has before it really does need to change. But the problem is that we've had digital now for quite a while, and people are not moving to it. The sales of digital are less than 10% of what is sold in print. And so even though, I think people expect it to flip over, it's not doing it yet. And there's a lot of questions of when's that going to happen? We've had this pandemic for the last year, and in the US, a lot of shops have been closed. There's been lockdowns and everything else, but comic sales are largely up this year, which nobody can wrap their head around. It doesn't make any sense. Why are comic sales actually increasing right now? I think the industry is in this very strange place where there's a definite belief that things are going to change soon, but nobody knows when or what the trigger is going to be to actually make that happen.
Fair enough. Could it be that with the COVID and all that maybe people are kind of stuck inside and they have more time on their hands? So
the films haven't been on, so they've not had the superhero fix.
True. True. That could be a possibility. Stop doing the movies, and maybe the comics will.
That might be the worry, that when they start releasing the movies again, sales will go down, which is unfortunate.
It is. I definitely think people are stuck inside looking for entertainment, for sure. I think that's one of those pieces. But comic books have to find their way. About every 20 years, there's a major change in comics. 20 years ago, we saw Marvel kind of shift to their Ultimate line. They put more of an emphasis on writers. You saw DC follow suit. We had the New 52 about 10 years after that. So there were a lot of changes that happened about 20 years ago. And we're at that point again where comics are going to change. There is going to be a major shift in how they're created or how they're marketed and everything else. And my prediction is that you're just kind of what we talked about at the beginning. You're going to see a very tight alignment with movies. And that's really what we're looking for.
Very cool. Well, we often like to, at the end of the podcast, bring it back to kind of YouTube, depending on, it doesn't matter what the topic is.
Sure.
What did you do kind of that got you inspired to get you into doing YouTube and what you do? Actually, before we get into that, explain to our audience what it is you do on YouTube.
So I put out little 10-minute shows, about 10 minutes, just talking about different parts of the comic industry. And sometimes it's talking about a particular title. Sometimes it's a review of a new book. Sometimes I do interviews with creators and get those out there. Those always go longer. And sometimes it's just trying to explain things about the industry that people didn't know, like how comics get shipped and how the sales numbers work and that kind of thing. And sometimes it's asking some questions. There's a lot of outrage YouTube out there. I don't do that, But I do try and address the question of, why are people mad? What got people upset about this? And is it reasonable, or is it not reasonable that they're upset? So I got into doing the YouTube channel a bit by accident, to be honest. I would write things on Twitter or on Facebook. I'd post little things, and finally people would say, hey, you have more to say than a tweet, so why don't you just put it on YouTube? You'll be able to talk longer, and you'll make your point better. So I thought, why not? So I started doing the channel. I really had zero expectations of what it would do. I thought, 4 people will listen to me there, and that's cool. And I didn't really care if it was more than that. And it's been a weird year. I've had a successful year. I'm still small, all things considered. You talk about, Comicstorian or Comics Explained, that's 100,000 plus. I mean, I think some of those guys are in a million territory.
Yeah.
So I'm tiny compared to those guys, of course, but I do enjoy it, and it's fun interacting with people. So that's why I do it.
Oh, brilliant.
So would you say, is this your first channel, or have you had previous channels in the past, or about other topics?
Nope, it's my first channel. So I started in April of last year and really did nothing for all of last year. And it was really this year, about March, that I started to do more and really put more content out and put some effort into it. And so I'm new to this, so I'm making mistakes constantly putting the shows out, I think.
Well, you always you learn from your mistakes, and so that's what we've been doing as well. Is there a YouTuber, or do you watch many other YouTubers?
Not as much as I used to. So I have a good partnership with a guy named Wes, who does a show called Thinking Critical, and I'll be on his show from time to time. We'll do analysis together. He does great work. But I used to watch a lot more YouTube than I do in comics. Now I watch plenty of YouTube outside of comics. I think lots of the there's a guy, I think he is in the UK, Uncle Roger, that does hilarious stuff with cooking that is very funny. So stuff like that. But in comics, really a lot less than I used to. I used to watch more of Comics Explained and Comicstorian and those guys, for sure.
So is there a YouTuber that you'd say inspires you to do what you do, or is it all kind of from yourself?
Well, these days it's just kind of frantic, so it's less inspiration. But I do like how the clean, tight editing of an Aussie man or somebody like that puts stuff together, and it's funny, and there's some good commentary there. I always hope that I can get to that at some point, but it's a very different product from what I do. But that stuff's always cool to watch.
So what would you say is your favorite thing about doing YouTube?
Well, I get great comments, especially right now this year, without being, I can't have my store open, and I'm moving stores. So it's kind of in this middle place, but I love talking to customers and people who come in and be able to have those chats. And so here, where we're locked at home, the YouTube is that outlet, and it's one directional, but still people come in and I think somewhat unique to my channel. I don't know if others are the same. People come in and leave comments, like really long, like pages and pages of comments of thoughts. And so I have pretty in-depth discussions there that I really appreciate. So it's a chance to kind of engage with people, and I love that.
That's really nice. We aren't big enough yet to have received any of those long paragraphs, but maybe one day in the future. You said that you've made some mistakes in your YouTube career so far, but is there anything looking back that you actually want to change about what you've done on YouTube so far?
Well, I think that I started producing just a lot of content, and I really didn't have a plan. I think that a more structured, and it's something I'll try and do more next year, where you have a more scheduled kind of rollout of things you're going to do. You're going to do a review this day, and you're going to do maybe an analysis this next day, and some history kind of thing the next day, and have it be more organized. I mean, the reality is I'm sitting here and I've got, I think, easily, I don't know where I'm at. I think more than 1,000 videos, probably getting closer to 2,000 at this point. And, most people will never listen to the majority of those. So I have in the last 6 months or so, my audience has really grown, but there's that content that I did for that first year is just gone. It's up, but I mean, who's ever going to find that? And so I think having a more organized plan would be a good idea. I think that if people are coming out and they're going to do stuff with YouTube, having a good reliable schedule in mind and putting stuff out at the same time when you're doing it, whatever your schedule is, I think is a good idea. And so I learned a lot of that the hard way of just kind of randomly putting content out, and you'd put effort into something and then you'd get, 100 views. And then there's if you have more of a plan, you're going to be more successful.
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah. So what would you say your future goals are for your channel?
Well, I'd like to continue to grow it for sure. I'd like to get more stuff out there. I'd like it to be organized and have some nice scheduled stuff. I'm getting a lot of interviews at this point queued up with other comic creators and writers, and so I want to give that more of a voice. I do different interviews than I think a lot. I'm less interested in what the book they're trying to promote right now is, and trying to get more into what makes this person tick, or how's this person view the industry. And so I'm wanting to do a lot more of those and get a lot more kind of a routine around content that's put out, and hopefully keep putting out stuff that people like.
That's lovely.
So wanted to ask, I wonder what your opinion is on the rumors coming out about the next Spider-Man 3 movie.
It's a lot of people in it. No, it'll be fun. It's Marvel wants to play in this multiverse. You have a Doctor Strange movie that's going to have the multiverse, and then you have Spider-Man. Obviously, they did that with the Miles Morales. The animated movie they did was the multiverse. So I get why they do this. In some cases, it's a little bit of a nostalgia bait, because you can bring back all these previous actors that people have been wanting to see, and you don't have to build a whole movie around them. I think Marvel or Sony does not want to do another Andrew Garfield movie, but they know there's some fans out there, so they can bring him back for a little guest cameo, and you get some fan service out of that. And I don't know, the movie can be fun. I just hope there's a plot behind it that's reasonable and good. A lot of these movies, they're really built around like, hey, do you remember this guy and this person? And how about this person over here? Do you remember them? And I want there to be a plot in there too, hopefully.
Yeah, no. Did you see the tweet that got taken down straight away with the 3 Spider-Men standing on a roof with Jamie Foxx's eyes in the thunderclouds or something? Yeah. That's definitely I feel like it's probably not accurate, but it's just a way of getting hype around the movie, because it looked like you had Miles Morales from the multiverse Spider-Verse movie. It looked like you had Tom Holland as Spider-Man, and then you had another Spider-Man. So that's just it's definitely a way of making. I think the hype around that next Spider-Man movie already, even though it's not even finished filming yet, is going to be would you say almost Avengers level hype?
It has the potential to be it. Yeah. I mean, if they keep building it this way and they can roll out, I mean, they need at this point to roll out a really epic threat villain. I mean, if you can pull that off as well. I know you've got Alfred Molina, I believe, is in that movie as kind of reprising Dr. Octopus. And I mean, if you can throw out a really major threat, then the hype's going to grow. I think at that point, people will be starved and ready to get to movies. So hopefully that also helps.
Could it be a multiversal Sinister Six, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. That feels like where they're going with it, but it can be big.
Yeah, I've heard that some of the TV shows and Doctor Strange is going to tie into it as well. So
the Scarlet Witch one, because that's multiversal.
Yeah.
It's we have to, as comic fans or as movie watchers, we're going to have to get very used to alternate realities and multiverse stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I feel like as comic book fans, we're relatively used to that by now.
Yeah, we should. You'd hope so.
You would hope so. Well, is there anything else, Ben, you want to talk about with Perch?
No, that's fine, I think.
All right. Well, I think it's been a pleasure. It has been a pleasure talking about comics. A secret passion of mine, which
Excellent.
has been lovely. We'll have a link to Perch's channel down below in the comments, so please do make sure to check it out. He's got some fantastic content out there. If he hasn't sold it enough on here, I don't know how else he could sell it. this will be out on Sunday, so I think our next podcast for you viewers will be our Christmas special. We've got 2 returning guests of Fab and Cam, and it's going to be a few drinks, so I hope you guys do check that out when it comes out. But yeah, thank you, Perch, for coming on. I hope you enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure talking to you today. And yeah, thank you very much.
All right, brilliant. Well, subscribe if you guys are new around here. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and make sure to check out Perch in the comments below. Goodbye.